On February 11, 1990, after 27 years in prison, 18 of them spent largely on Robben Island breaking rocks in a limestone quarry, Nelson Mandela walked out into a free world for the first time as a 61-year-old man. The decades he lost are almost impossible to fully account for. His children grew up without him, his marriage did not survive the separation, and an entire generation of South African history unfolded entirely without his direct participation, despite his being its central, imprisoned symbol throughout. What happened next is the part of his story most relevant to this series, and the part hardest to actually absorb. He did not emerge seeking retribution. He became president 4 years later and governed, deliberately and explicitly, through a policy of reconciliation with the very system and the very people who had imprisoned him for nearly 3 decades. This was not naive forgiveness or forgetting. It was, by his own later account, a carefully reasoned philosophical position, arrived at gradually, during the imprisonment itself. It's important to be specific about the conditions Mandela endured, because the philosophical lesson only carries weight against the real difficulty of the test. On Robben Island, prisoners were classified by race, with black prisoners like Mandela receiving the harshest conditions, the least food, and the fewest privileges of any group. He performed hard labor in a lime quarry for years, work that damaged his eyesight permanently from the glare of sunlight on white stone, a condition that prevented him, for the rest of his life, from being photographed with flash photography. He was permitted 1 visitor and 1 letter every 6 months for much of his imprisonment, and was not allowed to attend his own mother's funeral, nor his elder sons, both of whom died while he was incarcerated. He spent significant stretches in solitary confinement. This was not a brief or survivable hardship that resolved itself after a few difficult years. It was a sustained, deliberately punishing imprisonment that lasted essentially the entirety of what would otherwise have been the most productive decades of an adult life. Mandela later wrote, in his autobiography, about a realization he reached during his imprisonment that echoes, almost precisely, language we have already encountered from Epictetus and from Viktor Frankl in this series. He described coming to understand that the authorities could control nearly every aspect of his physical existence, his movement, his diet, his contact with the outside world, but that his mind and his heart remained his own, and that this recognition became the foundation of his ability to endure. This was not a single epiphany but a discipline developed and maintained across years, requiring constant renewal under conditions specifically designed to erode it. Prison authorities, by Mandela's own account, used deliberate psychological tactics intended to provoke despair or rage, and the daily practice of maintaining composure and clarity under that pressure was, in his telling, exhausting and never fully automatic, something that had to be actively chosen and rechosen, repeatedly, for thousands of consecutive days. It would misunderstand Mandela's approach to describe it simply as forgiveness in a soft, sentimental sense. What he actually practiced, upon release and throughout his presidency, was closer to a clear-eyed strategic calculation, reasoned through during his imprisonment, that a cycle of retribution would simply produce further violence and instability, while a deliberate practice of reconciliation, difficult and personally costly as it was, offered the only realistic path to a stable, functioning country. He established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which required confronting, in detail and in public, the specific atrocities committed under apartheid, rather than simply moving past them unexamined. This was not avoidance of the brutal facts, in Stockdale's phrase from an earlier episode. It was direct, sustained confrontation with those facts, paired with a deliberate choice about how to respond to them that prioritized long-term stability over the immediate, understandable satisfaction of retribution. This is the dichotomy of control operating at the scale of an entire nation. Mandela could not undo 27 years of his own imprisonment, nor centuries of the system that produced it. What remained within his control, and within the country's control under his leadership, was the choice of how to move forward from that fixed, unchangeable history. Mandela's own writing reveals direct engagement with Stoic and Stoic-adjacent thought during his imprisonment, including documented influence from the poem Invictus, which he is reported to have recited to fellow prisoners, and broader reading in philosophy that informed his thinking about freedom of mind under physical constraint. The core mechanism he describes, that what is taken from you and what remains within your control are fundamentally different categories, and that durable strength comes from focusing entirely on the second category, is the same mechanism this series has now traced through Epictetus directly, through Stockdale's prison cell, and through Frankel's concentration camp. Mandela extends this principle into a domain the earlier figures in this series did not fully address, the application of inner discipline not just to personal survival, but to the design of a political and social response at the scale of an entire society, transforming a personal philosophical practice into the founding principle of a national policy. Here's something to try this week, drawn directly from Mandela's example, scaled down to ordinary circumstances. Identify a grievance you are currently holding, large or small, where you have some choice about how to respond going forward. Ask the question his own approach suggests, not whether the original wrong was justified, it likely was not, but what response, going forward, actually serves the outcome you want, rather than simply the outcome that would feel satisfying in the moment. This does not mean pretending the original event did not happen, or that it did not matter. Mandela's truth and reconciliation process insisted on the opposite, full, detailed acknowledgement of what had actually occurred. It means separating that acknowledgement from the question of what your response should be, and choosing the response deliberately, based on where you actually want to end up, rather than reactively, based only on what was done to you. He died in 2013, having served a single term as president before voluntarily stepping aside, a decision that was, in its own way, a final demonstration of the same discipline, choosing what the situation required over what personal ambition might have preferred. That discipline is the thread that has run through every figure in this series so far, people who built extraordinary strength by mastering what was within their control. Next week, we turn that thread around. The next arc, Villain's Code, looks at figures history remembers not for their composure but for their ruthlessness, men whose discipline built empires, systems, and reputations, and whose methods came at a cost this series will not look away from. We start with a starving, enslaved boy on the Mongolian steppe who built the largest land empire history has ever seen, and we'll ask the same question about him that we've asked about everyone in this series. What was the actual mechanism, and what did it cost? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.